Hello, and welcome to My Finance Teacher. Let's talk about business cycles, how the economies adjust after some, say, recessionary shock, how do the economies recover from a recession, or how do economies cool down a little bit if things are getting a little bit overheated. And for this discussion, we're going to use the ASAD model, aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And if you haven't seen the recent video on the basics of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, I suggest you have a look at that video first. For now, though, let's first review our understanding of business cycles. Basically, it's a periodic but rather unpredictable fluctuation of real GDP. Let's try to illustrate it on a chart where I have GDP on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. This wavy line over here is our real GDP. As you see, it generally fluctuates up and down. Recessions bring GDP down, such as, let's say, during the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. More recently, significant drops all over the world due to the pandemic. And of course, GDP does tend to recover. The economies do recover from those recessions. Actual ongoing current GDP fluctuates somewhere around its potential GDP. A reminder on potential GDP is it's basically maximum sustainable level of GDP that can be produced in the long term. Sometimes temporarily, ongoing GDP can be above potential GDP, but it cannot be sustained over a long term with extremely low, unusually low unemployment levels. That's if you are preparing for your tests and only sleeping for 4 hours a night. You can work hard temporarily in this way, but it's not sustainable in the long term. Now let's jump into our analysis of these business cycles and how the economy adjusts back towards its potential GDP from a recession or from overheating using this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We have long-run aggregate supply, which is vertical at the level of potential GDP. We have GDP on the horizontal axis over here and the price level, general price level of many products in the economy on the vertical axis. We also have aggregate demand over here, demand that comes from the individuals and firms in the country as well as the rest of the world. And short-run aggregate supply, which shows the total goods and services produced within the short run before the wages and other costs of production have time to adjust. And let's say our starting point is this long-term macroeconomic equilibrium, the intersection between long-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. Say things have been pretty stable in this country for quite a while, hence the economy has reached its long-term macroeconomic equilibrium where current GDP is equal to potential GDP, and a shock to the economy. Say, for example, the recent pandemic, where people are forced to stay at home due to the lockdowns. We can't go to all the restaurants and movie theaters that we want to go to. That reduces aggregate demand in the country, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left from AD to AD2. Initially, as this happens, the new equilibrium moves from original point E1 to the new equilibrium at point E2. That is the short-term macroeconomic equilibrium, the intersection between AD2, aggregate demand, and short-run aggregate supply curve, SAS. At this new equilibrium, E2, prices have dropped due to the lower aggregate demand, and also at this new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, E2, GDP has also dropped. Current GDP is below potential GDP, which brings us to output gap. Output gap is the difference between current GDP and potential GDP. There are two types of output gaps. In this case, we have a recessionary gap or a negative output gap. Negative output gap indicates that the economy is basically in the recession. The GDP that is produced right now is below what country could sustainably produce in the long term. So the economy is experiencing some level of recession. So again, this is a recessionary output gap. Things are painful as a lot of restaurants and movie theaters close down, a lot of people lose jobs. Temporarily, things are very painful. But even if the governments don't step in to help the economy out of the recession, the economy will still adjust. Let's see how it happens. The economic adjustment. When the economy is at this equilibrium at E2, unemployment is very, very high, which reduces the wages as a lot of unemployed workers are competing for scarce jobs. This reduces wages, and a lot of capital is also unemployed. Perhaps some factories, some movie theaters and restaurants are empty. That also reduces the price of renting those spaces. All of that reduces the production costs, and when production costs decrease, short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. All of that doesn't happen in a moment, that happens gradually. So gradually this short-run aggregate supply curve is slowly shifting rightwards until the output gap disappears. During the process of adjustment, real GDP increases back to the level of potential GDP, and the price level actually, as we see, keeps dropping as the economy moves from the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium at E2 towards the longer-term macroeconomic equilibrium at E3. And that is the adjustment in one of the scenarios which was initiated by the decline in aggregate demand. Let's have a look at another scenario where from our long-term macroeconomic equilibrium at E1, the economy experiences another economic shock. In this case, perhaps oil price shoots up due to some instability in the Middle East. This increases transportation costs and other production costs, shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. And as a result, of course, the economy moves from the long-term macroeconomic equilibrium at E1 to the short-term macroeconomic equilibrium at E2, where price level has also increased and the output, the real GDP produced, has decreased because production is now more costly with higher transportation costs and other energy costs. That leads to a negative output gap as well. We have a recessionary output gap. In this case, the recession was initiated not by the drop in aggregate demand. Instead, the recession was initiated by the reduction in aggregate supply. This actually came at the same time as the increase in price levels. So this sort of recession is also called stagflation. The economy is stagnating, we're not producing as much as we could potentially, and at the same time we're experiencing inflation, so a stagflation. Again, the economy is not going to stay at E2 forever. The economy is going to adjust back to its long-term macroeconomic equilibrium. And how the adjustment is going to take place is that at this equilibrium of E2, unemployment again is very high, both unemployment of labor and capital, which reduces wages, which reduces the costs of borrowing that capital, which in turn reduces production costs, and gradually, things are not jumping over here from one point to the next. Gradually, reduced production costs shift the short-run aggregate supply curve back to the right until this output gap is eliminated. And the price level drops back to where it was as the economy comes back from the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium at E2 back to its long-term macroeconomic equilibrium at E1. So that's how adjustment takes place after a stagflationary shock to the economy. Both of these shocks, a drop in aggregate demand curve and a reduction in aggregate supply curve, initially brought a recessionary gap, a negative output gap. Let's have a look at another scenario where an economic shock brings a positive output gap, which is called inflationary gap. Let's say again the economy starts at the long-term macroeconomic equilibrium where current GDP is equal to potential GDP, and we have a positive economic shock, perhaps due to too much money printing, perhaps due to the neighboring countries becoming rich and buying a lot of our exports, which increases the aggregate demand for the products produced in this country. So all of that money printing and foreign purchases increase aggregate demand curve, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right from AD to AD2. That moves the economy to this new equilibrium at the intersection of blue AD2 and the still ongoing short-run aggregate supply curve. At the new equilibrium, as you've noticed, price level is higher, and currently the economy is producing at GDP levels above its potential GDP. It is possible in the short term, but it's not sustainable in the long term. Output gap is positive, and this output gap, a positive output gap, is called inflationary gap. The reason it's called inflationary is because if the governments don't step in, gradually the economy is going to adjust on its own, and that adjustment is going to lead to even further inflation. Let's see how that happens. Let's start with this short-term macroeconomic equilibrium. After that positive economic shock, the economy is at this equilibrium at the intersection between AD2 and SAS. At that level, as the GDP is above potential GDP, unemployment is unusually low. There is actually a labor shortage in the economy. All of the firms are, in this case, competing for workers, which pushes the wages higher. Rising wages increase the costs of production, and higher costs of production gradually, again, that happens over time, gradually shift the short-run average supply curve to the left from SAS to SAS2. And that process keeps going until this inflationary gap is eliminated and the economy is back at its potential GDP level on the new long-run macroeconomic equilibrium at the intersection of AD2 and LAS, where you've noticed that price levels have increased even further. So here's how the economy would adjust from an inflationary gap back towards the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Of course, another possible shock, another possible scenario for an inflationary gap is a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve for whatever reason, perhaps an influx of migrant workers reducing wages and at the same time oil prices dropping, reducing transportation and energy costs. And again, as usual, inflationary gap will gradually increase wages, bringing the economy back to its potential level of GDP. So I hope with all of this discussion, the macroeconomic adjustments that happen after some sort of a shock are more or less clear at the moment. Next, let's throw in some numbers to have a look at some examples. Let's say we have aggregate demand given by this equation, P equals 1200 minus 3 times Y. The short-run average supply is given by this equation, P equals 200 plus 2Y. And we're also told that potential GDP is at the level of 260. Let's say the task is to find the ongoing price level, the amount of output gap, the type of output gap, whether it's recessionary or inflationary output gap, and new price level after all of the adjustments, if any. So how would we answer these 3 questions? First of all, we would solve these 2 equations of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply as a system of equations to find the equilibrium where GDP is equal to 200 and the price level is equal to 600. That already answers our first question for the ongoing price level, which is at 600. And regarding the second question of output gap, which is the difference between current GDP and potential GDP, output gap is negative 60, telling us that it's a recessionary type of output gap. It is a recessionary gap. And during a recession, unemployment is really high, which pushes the wages lower, decreasing production costs, and which pushes the short-run average supply curve to the right as production costs fall, and the economy adjusts back towards its long-term macroeconomic equilibrium at potential level of GDP. So to answer the third question, I just want to throw in this long-term macroeconomic equilibrium with the level of GDP at potential GDP into the aggregate demand curve, because the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium is the intersection between this same aggregate demand curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve. So in that way, I can find what would be the new price level after all of the adjustments. If you plug in 260 for GDP in the aggregate demand curve, you'll find that the new price level is equal to 420. So there's a bit of a numerical example for you in a discussion of business cycles. and how do we analyze the business cycles using the economic model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I hope it's been helpful. If you like the content, remember to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Good luck on your tests and bye-bye.